Hi. Okay, we're going to talk attunement and attachment. One of my favorite topics in all of child and human development, and I believe about the most important, if not the most important. We know that in 0 to 2, one of the primary things that is happening is that we are building the architecture of the brain. That, a baby, an infant lays there and looks like all they do is like pee and poop and cry. But the truth is, with everything that's happening to them, their brain is wiring up. Neurons are firing and wiring constantly with the input from the environment and their perceptions that are growing within. They have the brain wired for expectant experiences. We have the visual center wired, and the auditory center is wired, and the motor center is being wired, and all of these things are ready for experience. That's why they call it experience expectant. And then when they get out into the world, then depending upon what their experiences are, those neurons fire and wire. So the visual and auditory and motor and emotional and all of these different systems within the brain will fire and wire experience dependent upon what happens between them and the environment and what continues to happen between them and the environment. The more patterns of neural firing that fire and wire together at the same time, the more the patterns happen, the more that becomes not just an experience, but a trait, a characteristic, a perception, a way of seeing and being in the world. And that's really important because in the 0 to 2, neuroplasticity, the time when the brain has the most opportunity to shape and mold itself, the times when it is most plastic is between 0 to 2, between about 4 to 6, and then again in adolescence. So this is like if we're building a house, this is the blueprint. This is the design upon which the rest will be built. We can remodel later, but this is the blueprint. And so it is incredibly, incredibly important. And so what we're going to talk about is a lot of brain stuff in here, as well as this attachment information that you can also find in a text or in books or in all kinds of places. But this is, I'm going to share with you the way I like to go through this. So here we go. I'm going to put myself down here on the bottom. And, let me say one more thing. I'm going to do this somewhat as if we were in a class together. It might be a little bit longer. If you want to take a break, I might break it up somewhere, or I might keep going. I really haven't decided till I get into it. So if you want to take a break, take a break. If you don't want to watch the video that I might show during the recording, don't watch it. Skip through it. Watch it later. But I'm going to do this a little bit like we're in a class. I'm going to skip a couple of the videos that you can watch on your own. But some I'm going to watch a couple while we talk about this. Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is the first part of the 20th century. Behaviorism kind of ruled the day in terms of development. It's what was most followed by, it just kind of was in the forefront. And for parenting. So attachment was mostly believed to be a survival mechanism about feeding. So in the words of behaviorism, John Watson and Skinner and all the rest in that camp, parents were really buying into this format that, a child reached for mom because of association between mom and food. And that was it. Like that it was really about survival, and that we don't show too much affection. We don't hold too much. We don't nurture too much, because then we will make them dependent and they will be spoiled and all those kinds of things. So that was really the ruling of the day, without a whole lot of research to back it up. There was not really much to back it up, but it was just the belief, and it was pervasive among parenting. So parents really didn't do a lot of holding, and I know my own mom was like, we just used to vacuum around you, what is all this holding of the baby? It's crazy. So that's just kind of that was the culture, that was the agreement that we made within our culture of how you raise children. Also that there was no language capacity in these first 2 years, really. So there was obviously no consciousness. It just wasn't believed. And remember, behaviorism, there wasn't a whole lot of stress put on cognitive processes, and whatever might be, not in these first 2 years, because it wasn't believed that there was a whole lot of it, because there was no language. There was just this link made between the ability to communicate and the ability to think. Hold on a second, sorry. So we begin to see, in the second half of the 20th century, we see a shift a little bit more into cognitive and humanism, and a different slant on psychoanalysis begins to come into play with this, which we'll see with a couple of our big people for attachment. Not Freudian necessarily psychoanalysis was psychosexual, but a different kind. 1990s was called the decade of the brain. And that was actually a political kind of thing, with George Bush actually making it the decade of the brain, putting more monies toward research on the brain. But what that did do was it really did create more research and created more knowledge of the brain. And since then, it has just been exponential. I mean, exponential in what we have learned about how the brain works. And what I find really interesting, this is going to be my own little linkage here, is that in that same era, actually in 1990, was the first time we heard the term emotional intelligence in any kind of documentation by Peter Salovey and John Mayer, not the singer. And they wrote an article called Emotional Intelligence. And it was the first time that we had seen that. And since the 1990s, that too has been growing. And since neuroscience and the understanding of the brain, affective neuroscience, the understanding of emotions in the brain, have really linked themselves, 1, to emotional intelligence, 2, to child development. And so all of these things are kind of, they're beginning to intersect. So the 21st century, that we have seen a shift in infancy development, infancy studies and research, to emotional and social development. And as we learn about the brain, that seems to play a really big piece in it. And the belief that infants do have consciousness, that they are reading emotional and social cues, that is the learning that they do. If you watched the screencast on memory learning, in the brain that I did, then I talked a lot about how, and we're going to talk more about how that is what babies do, as they're very right brain oriented, and this is the information that comes into them. And so that is really, all this information on the brain is really intersecting with our infancy development and our understanding of human development, in really remarkable ways, that is growing. And also, this is the beginning of any kind of emotional intelligence. When I talk about emotional intelligence, I mean our capacity to understand, know, assess, and choose how, our emotional presence in the world, internal and external. And it is built, the architecture of that is what is primarily built in the first year of life. Okay. So here's our friend Harry Harlow. Just so you understand, psychoanalysis, Freud and Erikson and all, psychoanalysis is really about the importance of early experience on development. Now Harlow and Bowlby, Bowlby was a psychoanalyst. Harlow was not a Freudian, didn't really consider himself a psychoanalyst, but definitely both of them studied and researched how external relationships are crucial to early development, and major fathers in this movement in their different ways, but also together. They knew each other, they communicated, they were on different continents. We're going to talk more about them. John Bowlby was in England, Harry Harlow was in Wisconsin, and they became aware of each other, and their work really, it helped. One helped the other to, Bowlby helped Harlow give parameters and direction to his experiments, and his experiments helped Harlow's experience helped Bowlby scientifically prove what he was trying to show. And we'll talk more about that. Both of them were influenced, and we see this a lot, by Lorenz, and I am going to let you watch this video on your own if you want to. Now, Lorenz was the one who, if you've ever heard of it, talked about imprinting in geese. So he, more of like in the biologies, and, both of these psychologists believing we had a lot to learn from animal relationships and how attachments happened there, and from our evolution. And that, yes, that we are driven at some extent for protection as well as survival. And that these mechanisms are biologically built into us, that we have an innate drive to survive and therefore to attach, and that our bodies and brains and minds and beings are set up, we are experience expectant to attach for survival. And that, but what they learned is that part of that survival included comfort and love. But Lorenz talked about, they were both influenced by him, so I find it kind of an interesting thing, but it just shows how he did studies on geese and kind of imprinting, how when they were born, kind of the first they saw, they would imprint upon and follow around. Like he had a goose that basically thought it was its mother. And, that there was a real bond built in that. And so they anyway, you can watch that. Harry Harlow worked at the University of Wisconsin. He started there in 1930. For a long time, though, because it wasn't until the 1950s that he became affiliated with John Bowlby and the more directed experiments on attachment and so forth. But he started studying monkey cognition and learning, and he used monkeys because they were the most people-like. Now, when we watched, I'm going to let you watch the monkey video on your own too. It is sad. It is really sad to watch experiments with monkeys. And I believe that. Classes I show it to almost break down. It's really hard. And it's a hard place and we don't see work like this done with monkeys as much, though we do a lot of it on rats. We still do. But monkeys were the most human-like. And so he believed that they would have the most to tell us about how humans would respond to something. We learned a lot. That's the hard part. We learned a lot about human children and the way we parent and the way we treat them and the things that we do. So it's a really hard one. But he started studying monkey cognition and learning, and he figured out he needed nursery-raised infant monkeys that were available immediately. So he needed monkeys available, so he raised them in nurseries. But what he noticed was that these monkeys were odd, that they had very odd and abnormal behaviors when they had been taken from their mothers as compared to monkeys who were raised by their mothers. So he started noticing this, and you have to remember this wasn't a question in our culture so much. And he really wanted to prove the behaviorists wrong, that there was nothing to attachment between the mother-infant bond other than feeding and survival for those things. And he wanted to know why these monkeys were so different. And so at the same time, but on a different continent, John Bowlby in London was working, he was mostly interested, he was a psychoanalyst and a psychologist, and I believe a psychiatrist as well, but he was very interested in institutionalized children, like the maladaptive development of institutionalized children. And I have him on the next slide, but really children after World War II that were orphaned. Because they were separated from their families, and how this separation from mothers and so forth influenced their development. So they started communicating, and not email. I don't know if I said that earlier, but not by email in the 1950s, but they started communicating with each other. And so Bowlby took I tend to get them mixed up. Harlow took an interest in Bowlby's work, both of them looking at the science of love and how development and this bond were interconnecting, and both sort of wanted to disprove this whole drive towards behaviorism. And so as I said, their work informed each other. You can watch this video. These are Harlow's monkeys, in which he shows the difference between monkeys that are isolated from their mothers, and he started doing this on purpose. Isolating them from their mothers to see how they develop differently than monkeys who were raised with their mothers. One of his famous ones is with the wire monkey, where he has the wire monkey with the bottle, and he has the cloth monkey, And behaviorism would tell us that the monkey would go to the wire monkey with the bottle because it was all about feeding. And what we found is that the monkey would go to the wire monkey to eat, but then immediately go to the cloth monkey where it would spend hours and hours and hours and hours a day just seeking that closeness. And if you also watched the video on movement, that's an interesting one too that has a lot about Harlow's some of Harlow's stuff as well. Okay, so Harlow built a laboratory from scrap lumber at the University of Wisconsin, which became the primate laboratory, and lots and lots of research with monkeys were done there. And so here's the deal. His experiments added scientific legitimacy to two powerful arguments against institutional child care, because even in orphanages based on behaviorism, caretakers were not touching children. They were not holding them. There was this belief that that was not the right thing to do. So against the institutional child care and favor of psychological parenthood. So as painful as these experiments are, I don't know how we would have gotten there without them. So it's a really hard question. And we began to shift some to, it shocked sort of the world of psychology when his experiment showed this in terms of the importance of love to child development. So John Bowlby was also there in the 1950s and 60s. Here's a quote by him: "If a community values its children, it must cherish its mothers." Very interested in the psychological development of orphans separated from their families after World War II. He is considered the father of attachment theory. And we're going to talk about a man named Alan Shore, who is sometimes called the American Bowlby. He is now at work and in play in the field. And he is kind of our second father. Maybe Bowlby is the grandfather of attachment theory. He worked with a woman named Mary Ainsworth, who was first his student and then his colleague, she created something called the strange situation, which we'll look at, to assess attachment styles. And I'm going to read these quotes. I think this is important. He came up with the idea of working models, and I will use this term a lot because I think it's valuable. Each individual builds working models of the world and of himself in it, with the aid of which he perceives events, forecasts the future, and constructs his plans. In the working models of the world that anyone builds, a key feature is his notion of who his attachment figures are, where they may be found, and how they may be expected to respond. Similarly, in the working models of the self that anyone builds, a key feature is his notion of how acceptable or unacceptable he himself is in the eyes of his attachment figures. So through our attachment relationships, we create a working model of who attachment figures are, of how we can expect them to respond, who we are. And we even build a working model of ourselves in terms of how acceptable or unacceptable we are. We take this model, because his next quote then says, so this is from Alan Shore, who is that American Bowlby, quoting Bowlby, because I heard Shore speaking, and this is a quote he gave of Bowlby's. "We continuously activate the attachment mechanisms and internal working models of other human beings who are guiding our emotional relationships. They are acting beneath conscious awareness and are shaped by attachment relationships." So, as we then go through our lives, we continually get activated, our working models get activated, and we activate other people's working models in the other relationships we have through our lives. So maybe what we came to expect in response from our attachment figures early in life, in that first year of life, we sort of begin to expect from the rest of the world in other emotional relationships. Who we saw ourselves as, how acceptable or unacceptable, worthy or unworthy in those first dynamic relationships might carry over to our other emotional relationships. And that's where such a kicker of it is, right? Okay. So this is actually from my last screencast PowerPoint. I just wanted to remind you of this, that working models of early relationships are deeply encoded in the brain by the first birthday. They are based on repeated patterns of interaction. We're going to talk more and more about this. Repeated experience ingrain emotional responses to them into the neural net profiles of the brain. Chronic occurrence makes the states more readily activated. So the more something happens, the more those states become activated and become characteristics of the person. In a way, lives become shaped by reactivations of these working models. So that's from the other one. I just wanted to put that in as a reminder we a little bit talked about these working models. So we're going to talk, whenever I mention working models, this is what we're talking about. Bowlby's idea of what we build into our architecture of our brain is a lot about how we see ourselves, who we see ourselves, and what we can expect from other people. All right, so then let's look at caregivers in the attachment model world. Studies show a lot of the information I'm going to give you is from Alan Shore, who does a lot of talking about Bowlby and his original work that's been done since then in the study of attachment through this 21st century time period that we've had, through the decade of the brain and what we're learning about it and how attachment shows up in the brain. Studies show that women are better at reading faces and expressing emotions through their faces than men. Men, I am not trying to say that there is not importance to fathers, because I'm talking right now about the caregivers, though. And Bowlby said it 60 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, and new research is even showing it, that there's something different about the connection, the bond with a mother figure than there is with a father figure. And if we're talking about emotional development, and we'll see that we're talking about that first because that's what's online first, keep that in mind, that women are better. The first thing babies do, the things that they're first experts in, is reading faces. And women are better at reading faces and expressing emotions. So when babies are reading faces, there's more of this interplay that might be easier for babies. Study on 11th-month-old infants have shown that there are two brain systems that are at work. This limbic, subcortical for emotional processing. So there's two different systems, one for emotional processing, one that's cortical in the cortex, more involved in social understanding and cognitive tasks. And so what has been found is that primary maternal caregivers show up more activated in the emotional centers when they're with a baby. There's more sort of interplay between these emotional centers. And for fathers, paternal caregivers, there's greater activation in cognitive centers. So, what do you think of that? The mother-infant bond is primary in the first year, stress and fear regulation. That the first year of life is a lot about building stress and fear, right? Is about regulating stress and fear. Regulating initial stress responses and fear responses and emotional responses to things. It's really about that emotional responses. Father-infant bond becomes more primary in the second year because that's more when aggression or, like frustration can come online. Aggression regulation, when toddlers have to learn how to manage their aggression, their frustration, their anger, that fathers can actually become a bigger part of that. Neuroscience and psychology agree that mother-infant bond is primary in the first year. So take that as you may. That does not mean that, sometimes all a child has is a father, and that's okay. But I think the learning and the knowledge of this can help even fathers to know what they're going to give more maybe naturally and what maybe they can't give as naturally without consciously knowing it. So there's learning to be had in all of this. Synchrony, I'm going to hide myself here. Okay. Synchrony is attunement. Okay, so this is the very first thing that happens even before attachment, real attachment can come online. The first kind of step in it is called synchrony. It's it's in the first few months before a child is mobile. It's really in the first year. We're going to see more of this, certainly before the child is able to move around. And then they're not going to do a whole lot of eye-to-eye gazing. So synchrony is the face-to-face eye gazing in first several months. Baby attracted to mom's voice and face, to their eyes. And the mom, and this is mom and baby reading each other, really looking, or caregiver and baby really looking in each other's eyes, reading each other's emotions, regulating each other through that. Synchrony is the caregiver copying the infant's expressions, not the other way around. This isn't the baby modeling the caregiver. This is the caregiver copying the baby. Baby's distressed. Oh, we give that look of distress. And then we kind of help them. We bounce them. We hold them. We speak to them. And through all of that, they then downregulate and helps regulate emotions. Infants also then can see what their emotions that they're feeling look like when they can see those facial expressions that display them. Oh, this looks like that. This is what I feel, and this is what now, granted, they're not saying all this, but this is what they're getting implicitly into them. So right brain to right brain communication through both brain and body. So let me say this and hear me. The right brain develops first in infants. It is strongest. It has a much stronger direct connection, not mediated through other stuff, other channels, direct connection to the insula, which reads body state. So much more direct connection to body state, how the body is feeling in an infant. That's going to be big. Much more direct connection to the limbic centers, which are emotional states. And so their right brain, it's also much more direct. It's much more connected. The right brain is all about nonverbal cues, reading the face, reading tone, reading posture. And it does this instantaneously. And this is the part that's online first and foremost. So what attunement is doing is cultivating a right brain to right brain connection between mother and child, between caregiver and child. Mother picks up the pleasures and the pains and emotions of the infant, feeling them in her body and regulating them. So the primary caregiver, which in attachment theory, they talk about it as being the mother primarily. So forgive me if that kind of touches buttons or anything. We become a surrogate regulatory system. Babies don't have a regulatory system. We want to, sometimes when they're crying, it's like, oh, please, just stop crying. They can't. They absolutely can't. They don't have a regulatory system yet that's online in any functional capacity. We help them build it. We help those neurons fire and wire. We become the surrogate regulatory system until there's a strong enough to do it themselves. Together, mom and baby co-regulate each other. They attune to each other's system, meaning baby is going to pick up how mom is feeling. That is going to either stress baby out more or help baby calm down. So the right hemisphere, RH stands for right hemisphere, is deeply connected to the autonomic nervous system, heart rate, body state of emotions, the sympathetic nervous system, and parasympathetic branches. So it's very in tune. We build their nervous system in this first year of life through this right brain to right brain connection and how we respond to them. The autonomic nervous system develops postnatally, and it is imprinted or developed through this attachment relationship. When in attunement, through feeding, nursing, eye gazing, mom and baby both experience a drop in heart rate, a drop in cortisol, stress hormone levels, an increase in oxytocin, or that love hormone. Immune and cardiovascular systems regulate together. So when a mom and a baby are really regulated, their body states get into the same space. If mom can downregulate, baby can downregulate. And we teach them that capacity. We fire and wire their nervous systems. A psychobiologically attuned caregiver, one who both by mind and body is attuned to their own feelings and able to help regulate the child, minimizes negative emotions through soothing and maximizes positive emotions through joy, through play, through love and tone. Now, I'm going to talk about a lot of this, and it's going to immediately come to feel like that means, so mom should never be stressed. She should always just be handling things perfectly. Hello. She should always be handling things perfectly. She should just always be in bliss. And if you're a mother, if you've been a mother, if you've been around a mother, that's like impossible. So let me say this up front. We're not talking about perfection. We're talking about good enough. There's actually a term, good enough. If we can be in attunement, if we can learn to regulate, say 60% of the time, then we're doing okay. All right. And we're going to talk more about what it can look like when we're not. But for right now, let's just keep that in mind. I'm going to just stop this so that it gives you a natural stopping place. I'm going to be picking right back up in the next one. I told you this one's going to be a little long. I'll see you in a minute.